Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Oasis Focus in Finance show. I'm your host Shafiq Morton. As always, it's great to be with you. In last week's show, we had a look at the financial planning considerations for those of us in the 20 to 30-year-old age groups. In today's show, we're going to have a look at what happens when you are in your 40s and 50s. Last week, we also emphasized that when you are young, it's important to start saving. If you start saving when you're 20 to 30s, it means that you can beat inflation and that you can enjoy a very comfortable retirement. But joining me today to discuss the issue of when you are between your 40s and 50s, Mansoor Mir and Daniel King. Mansoor, assalamu alaikum. Daniel, welcome.
Wa alaikum salam.
Good evening.
Mansoor, let's start off with you. What would be the major considerations for somebody who's in the 40 to 50-year-old age group? They've been saving through their 20s and 30s, now they're getting slightly more mature.
During this stage of your life, you're probably close to the peak of your career. Your salary is probably at the highest it's going to be. And this implies that the income that you're earning in most cases would exceed your expenses that you incur during your everyday life. I think we need to look at the effective ways that individual can save during the 40s and 50s, the most tax efficient manner in which vehicles he can use. For example, because his salary is at its peak, he's probably paying a huge amount of tax, so we need to look at vehicles that can help him with that. To explain some of the concerns I'd say an individual age 40, 50 would normally have, let's maybe use a case study and use an example. I'm going to use an example of Mr. Ismail to explain some of the concerns he might experience during this stage of his career. Mr. Ismail is 48 years of age, and to give a bit of a background of his family and financial position, he's married to Yasmin, who's 45 years of age. She's been a housewife pretty much for the last 15 years of her life. He has 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, aged 24, 22 and 16. The two daughters, the 24 and 22-year-olds, are become financially independent. The one is on the verge of getting married, so probably leaving the house very soon. The other one financially independent but still staying at home. And then obviously the youngest one being the son, who's just in his high school years at school basically. The whole family is in good health, Shafiq. As far as the financial standing is concerned, Mr. Ismail works in the corporate sector. He's got an income of roughly 80,000 Rand per month, that's gross income, which after deductions amounts to a net income of about 50,000 Rand a month. There isn't any major debt. There's a bond of 500,000 still remaining. He owns 2 properties, one of which the family resides in, the other being let out to a long-standing tenant, and he earns plus minus 8,000 Rand on a monthly basis. He's had a few jobs throughout his working career, but he was smart enough to actually preserve his pension over that period. He's accumulated retirement savings in the preservation fund is roughly around 3 million Rand. He has discretionary savings which are in a unit trust fund to the value of roughly 1.5 million Rand, and he is planning to retire at the age of 63. So 48 years old, retiring at the age of 63, that gives us a period of about 15 years. I think this is probably a very significant stage in his life as far as planning for his retirement is concerned. If we think about it in terms of his financial position, he's done relatively well up until this stage, but this is a significant part of his life where he needs to plan properly to ensure that he's going to retire comfortably and financially independent, be financially independent in his retirement years. We need to actively engage in the types of vehicles that he's going to be saving going forward. Remember, he's at the stage of his life where 2 of his children have become financially independent, which now means he's got much more disposable income. If we maybe just take a step back and look at his current retirement savings. So Mr. Ismail has 3 million Rand currently. If we fast forward 15 years, let's assume he gets an average return of about 8% per annum, that 3 million rand would be roughly 9,516,000 rand. His current employment, he's contributing about 10,000 rand on a monthly basis towards his retirement fund. Again, let's assume 8% growth over a 15-year period leading up to age 63. That would amount to roughly 3,460,000 rand. So his accumulated retirement savings at age 63 would be just under 13 million rand. That's 12,976,000. Now, if we look at the situation come retirement, let's assume he takes a portion of that in cash. 10 million rand of the 13 million he's putting into a living annuity. It sounds, when you look at it, 13 million retirement sounds like a lot of money. But if he draws an income of 6% from that 10 million rand, that's giving him a net income on a monthly basis of 38,000 rand. 12,000 rand less than what he's currently earning in today. That's not taking into account inflation over the 15-year period. So as much as it sounds like a lot of money, it isn't that much money in 15 years' time, Shafiq. So again, here we need to look at what he's going to do with that disposable income. There's a couple products that we can look at. One would be your retirement fund and maybe increasing towards your retirement fund contribution. We know with the current retirement fund reform changes that took place, government has increased that allowance that we're allowed to claim as a tax deduction from 15% per annum on your annual taxable income to 27.5% per annum, obviously capped at a maximum of 350. So if he's contributing 10,000 rand on a monthly basis, that's 120 he's putting away towards retirement savings. There probably will be, based on his income, enough opportunity to claim a bigger tax deduction, and in doing so he will get more back from the taxman over the 15 years in contributing. So that's one vehicle I would say we definitely need to look at. And then the other vehicle which government introduced over the last year is the tax-free saving account. He's allowed to put a maximum of 30,000 per annum, and not in his name, any of the children's name, his spouse's name, per annum, with a maximum of 500,000 over the lifetime. And in 15 years' time, once he's put 30,000 per annum, 500,000 away, whatever that money is grown to would be tax-free if and when he realizes from that investment. And I think the next 10 years in particular will be very critical because he is going to have much more disposable income. As I mentioned, the two children are becoming financially independent, the one's even leaving the house very shortly when she gets married. So over the next 10 years, I think his engagement with the financial advisor should become more prominent, and make sure he's visiting at least once a year to ensure that they're on the right track to achieve their goals for financial freedom during their retirement years.
Now, Mansoor, things can change in the case of Mr. Ismail. Let's say, for example, his parents need to move into his house, or the parents of his wife need to move into his house, or let's take it that his son is now going to study medicine and he's going to be out of circulation, economic circulation, for 8 to 10 years studying medicine, very expensive. What happens in a case like this?
Shafiq, it's actually good you brought that about. Look, there's a couple of factors. Remember, every individual is going to have their own nuances in their life cycle. And I think the important ones that you maybe mentioned, the first one I would say is healthcare.
Yes.
Very important, I would say, individuals should not leave joining a medical aid towards the latter parts of their life. Because if you do join a medical aid in your latter parts of your life, one, you're incurring late joiner penalties, loading on your premium because of your age, because of the risk at that stage of your age, basically. Join a medical aid when you're younger. The advantage of joining it when you're younger is you get to claim the contribution, or at least a portion of that contribution, as a tax deduction. So again, reducing your taxes. Based on your income at that level, you're obviously paying much more taxes, so we get to reduce your taxes. The other scenarios that change, tertiary education, son wanting to go study, and that's where your savings, like I said, your discretionary savings. So they mentioned in last week's program, when you are saving in your 20s to 30s, it's important to start saving towards retirement for your long-term goals, but at the same time, you need to have a portion of your savings in a discretionary investment, an investment which is for medium-term objectives and goals, where you have got access to money for events like school fees. Another factor to consider is weddings. He's got one daughter that's about to be married, and a wedding can take, depending on how lavish the daughter wants the wedding, and yes, a father wants to give his daughter the best of weddings. In most cases, it's not really the daughter's wedding, but the parents' wedding. They're reliving what they would have loved in their wedding, and you do spend a lot of money. You could look at anything between 80 to 150,000 rand on a wedding. So he needs to make sure there is cash available for those type of events. And then the comment you made, in a lot of cases you found that your parents might not have saved enough for their retirement, and you'd want to also in those years take care of them like they took care of you when you were younger, bring them into your homes, which means there's another mouth to feed basically. So that extra disposable income that you might have had now becomes a little less because you've got an additional person that you're catering for, and the additional person you're catering for, not only it's feeding and putting a roof over their head, but at the stage of their life, medical costs increase substantially. I think the one thing an individual must remember, the most single expensive expense in their lives when they hit retirement is going to be medical aid expenses. Because at that stage, your debt is cleared, you have got no bond, children are financially independent, they're out of it, they're done with university. As long as they catered for discretionary savings alongside their retirement savings, they should be able to manage those events over the years leading up towards retirement.
Daniel, not everybody is in the position of Mr. Ismail. So what do we do if we find somebody who's not in that comfortable position?
Yes, of course, Shafiq. I mean, life doesn't always go to plan. In fact, we know that it rarely ever does. And there are many reasons that could prevent Mr. and Mrs. Ismail from really maximizing their earnings in their 40s and 50s. They could get a divorce, they could run into health problems, or any number of large unplanned expenses that would significantly affect their financial position and therefore their financial goals ultimately. There are, of course, also a number of pleasant events that could occur, the birth of a first grandchild, for example. But ultimately, in all of these cases, it's absolutely critical that their overriding financial plan is flexible enough to manage these detours in life with as little discomfort as possible. Discretionary saving plans, in our view, like a tax-free investment account or a holding in a collective investment scheme, are essential in these kinds of cases. Mr. Ismail would have not only relatively easy access to his funds if he needed it, but also he could adjust the underlying exposure of his assets in terms of the mix of asset classes to conform to any new financial needs that might arise out of these unplanned or unforeseen events.
Now, Daniel, you mentioned amending one's exposure to financial products. What exactly do you mean by this? I mean, does it mean to say that we can actually change our investment profile as we go through our life stages?
Most long-term savings plans, whether it be a retirement fund or any number of collective investment schemes, for example, would invest in a spread of asset classes. So equity, property, and income typically being the fundamental asset classes. In the case of Mr. Ismail, he might be advised to maintain a mix of about 60% equity, 20% property, 20% income that would really put him in a position to kind of maximize growth to the extent possible while leaving a lid on the amount of risks that he is taking because of the income element of the portfolio. Now, if he encounters those unavoidable expenditures or life-changing events along the way, he might need to, for example, increase his retirement age. He might need to work for a longer period of time, earn his salary for a longer period of time to manage, to absorb the blow of those financial commitments. In that situation, he might want to have an increase in the amount of equity in his underlying portfolio because that's the asset class that's typically or traditionally going to give you the greatest potential for growth over a longer period of time. He could, of course, face a windfall, if financially speaking, and that might lead him to want to take an earlier retirement. In that case, he could increase the holdings of some of his income securities in his underlying assets to ensure that he's in a solid financial position, a more stable financial position, and also to start replacing his wage income as he heads into retirement. He wants to earn the income on his underlying assets. Changing the aggregate underlying exposures of your investment portfolio amongst the different asset classes is something that's actually relatively easy to do. with more sophisticated investment products like the investment products that are offered by Oasis. But of course, the ultimate mix that you do settle with should be taken in conjunction with a financial advisor before making such an amendment to your portfolio. It should take into account your unique risk appetite as well.
Yeah, in fact, that's an important point, isn't it, Mansoor? I think we call it risk attitude. How do we deal with this?
There's a unique attitude to risk for every individual. I mean, if we come back to the case study we've been working on, Mr. Ismail, age 40 to 50, the fact that we know he is planning to retire in 15 years' time, that we know that he's still got 15 years where he can expose himself to the higher yielding asset class, being equity, as Daniel mentioned. Daniel's absolutely right. At age 40 to 50, we'd probably look at a more moderate risk portfolio with a 60-20-20 split, 60 equity, 20 property, 20 cash. It's taking moderate risk, giving him enough equity exposure to get a inflation beating return. But at the same time, I'd say in 10 years' time, when he's reaching 57, 58, 5 years away from retirement, we'd probably move him from a balanced moderate portfolio to a balanced stable portfolio, reducing equity from 60 to 40, increasing the income component from 20 to 40. So it is relatively easy within the collective investment scheme arena to move an individual from a high to a moderate to a stable. I mean, currently, on my last meeting with Mr. Ismail, we actually saw that bulk of his assets was in the Oasis Crescent Equity Fund, which is the flagship fund of the Oasis Crescent Equity Fund, 100% of the money exposed to Crescent Equity. And we did the switch from Crescent Equity to the balanced progressive, the balanced moderate portfolio. Yes, it came with some capital gains tax, but based on the client's age, his risk profile, for me, it makes sense to move from an aggressive portfolio to a moderate portfolio to a portfolio that suits his age and risk profile right now.
What about the situation, Mansoor? Mr. Ismail, he is contributing towards a company pension fund. What is the potential, the possibility of him actually increasing his contributions to make it easier later on?
As I mentioned earlier, with government changing legislation and increasing the tax deductible allowance from 15% of annual taxable income to 27.5% annual taxable income, he's got one of two opportunities. He can contact his current retirement fund administrators, that's his employee retirement fund, and ask them that he'd like to make voluntary contributions to that, thus taking the 10,000 to slightly more that he's contributing on a monthly basis. I would ultimately tell him to let's look at a retirement annuity fund, because with a retirement annuity fund, he's got the choice as to where that funds are being managed, which fund manager. So if he wants it to be Sharia compliant, then Oasis has got the offering in a retirement fund, again with a high, moderate and stable approach. And again, there we'd go into the retirement annuity with a moderate portfolio right now with a 60-20-20 split for him, because that's the portfolio that suits the current position, his financial situation and his risk tolerance at this stage.
Daniel, as we go into our 40s and 50s, we develop assets, we develop fixed assets. But what about the issue of estate planning? We haven't discussed that one yet.
Yes, during this stage of your life, I think probably the most important thing when you're accumulating these assets is to draw up a will, if you haven't done so already. And in this sense, it's usually advisable that you talk to a licensed attorney who can ensure that your assets are not only protected, but that they're also being ceded to the correct beneficiaries ultimately. So in the case of Ismail, he may want to transfer his assets to the name of his wife if his estate is larger than hers. The second thing you might also want to do is to establish a trust, especially if you've got substantial assets and would want to leave your assets with your children, for example, under certain conditions. But it is worth bearing in mind that the tax benefits of putting your assets in a trust are not quite what they used to be.
Not
and
as attractive as
yes,
they used to be.
yeah. And this is obviously needs to be now a more carefully considered option. In terms of your retirement and insurance product exposures, most of these stipulate a beneficiary, and it's usually a good idea to make use of this condition in the policy, so that the benefits of these policies could be settled before the rest of the estate is ultimately wound up. And then fourthly, you should also probably give some thought to the possible donations in the future to a grandchild, for example, that could fall under the limit for donations tax, which is currently 100,000 Rand per year. In the case of Mr. Ismail, he probably needs to think about how he's going to get himself into a financial position that will facilitate the gifting phase in his life later on. So that might be a motive for investing in a collective investment scheme or a tax-free investment account again that could be placed in the name of a grandchild so that you can nurture in that child a culture of savings. You know, we have many clients who come in with their grandchildren into the office whenever they make an investment on their behalf so that they can really entrench the savings culture in that child and let them see firsthand the power of investing and the power of compounding returns.
Mansoor, what about this other important question? We've just spoken about estate planning, but what about the scenario of debt? What does debt mean to you in your 40s and 50s?
Somebody at the age 40, 50, like we said, is probably at his highest income earning potential. At that stage of his life, I believe he should have little to none debt because it's 20 years have passed, your bond should be paid up by then. Children have become financially independent, there's no more debt as far as education is concerned. But let's assume in Mr. Ismail's case, we said that the only debt he had was 500 and his rental income from the second property was covering that. So in his case, fortunately, he didn't have much debt. But for me, as far as debt's concerned, I think the most expensive, and that's your short-term debt, should be settled first when you do have disposable income. That would be credit cards, personal loans that you might have had, bank overdraft, because the interest rate that you're paying at with those debts is in excess of 17, 20% plus basically. So that's the first debt that one should settle when you do have excess disposable income. And then you look at your longer term debt, like your bond. Ideally, I believe anybody that is looking at retiring, they should be in a position where they're debt free. A common mistake I find, people opt for retirement, maybe take early retirement, 55 as opposed to 60, and then what happens is the retirement savings would have been enough, but because you've got this debt that's still outstanding, you end up taking the 1/3 portion of your retirement fund that you're allowed to take as a lump sum, which ideally should be used as emergency funds and luxury spend during your retirement years. You're now wiping a big chunk, if not all of that, out by killing debt at that stage. So for me, when one does decide to retire, you should by and large have very, very little debt at that stage.
We have to leave it there. Mansoor Mir, Daniel King, thanks for chatting to us.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of Focus on Finance. A special thanks to our guests, Mansoor Mir and Daniel King. Should you wish to watch this or any of our other shows, you can go online to the Oasis Crescent YouTube channel. Should you wish to contact Oasis, you can dial 0860 100 786 or email info@oasiscrescent.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Shafiq Morton. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.